After picking up an orphan from an abandoned junkyard, Jake rushed to his dying daughter and took her with him. As soon as she read the medication instructions in Swedish, Jake was horrified. Before we get started, write in the comments what city you're from. Enjoy the show. Jake gripped the steering wheel tighter as his black SUV rolled slowly down the abandoned country road. He didn't know how he'd ended up in this junkyard, but the fact remained that he'd been looping unsuccessfully between mounds of rubbish for the past hour. It had all started when he had spent the afternoon inspecting the site where he planned to build a new factory. Everything had gone according to plan until he had taken a wrong turn. Now, lost, he was desperate to find people who could point him back. His phone was dead, his sat-nav was useless. So the only hope left was the locals, if there were any. Suddenly he spotted a little girl. She was crawling over the piles of rubbish, digging in the dirt with her thin hands, as if looking for something important. She was wearing an old dark purple jacket, obviously not her size, not a child's, but rather her grandmother's, with a diamond pattern. The trousers were noticeably frayed and looked like she'd grown out of them long ago. Jake slowed down, then opened the window, leaned over, and called out loudly, "Hey girl, what are you doing here?" She didn't answer. Jake frowned. Maybe she's deaf, or maybe she's just scared. Breathing in the autumn air with a dash of musty waste smell, he climbed out of the car. His classic black jacket, which sat perfectly on his shoulders, clearly stood out against the surrounding devastation. His shoes were instantly covered in dust, but he didn't care. He came closer. Now the girl was looking directly at him, frightened but curious. "Can you hear me?" Jake repeated more softly. The child nodded silently. "What are you doing here?" She only shook her head negatively. Jake gritted his teeth. So she could talk, but she didn't want to. "Great. I'll have to guess," he thought grudgingly. "All right, I've got bananas. Want some?" The girl blinked and then, to his surprise, asked in a squeaky voice, "What are bananas?" Jake was taken aback. "Are you serious? You've never tasted a banana?" The child shook her head. "It's a fruit. It grows in hot countries, like Africa." The girl's eyes lit up. "Africa? Oh, then I definitely want to try it." Jake grinned involuntarily. How small and naive she was. He opened the car door, inviting her inside. She hesitated a moment, then timidly stepped forward, but she couldn't get in on her own, it was too high. "Let me help you," Jake said, and he easily picked her up under his arms and put her in the passenger seat. As soon as she was in the car, the fear in her eyes changed to genuine delight. "Wow, what a huge car," she exclaimed delightedly. "I've only ever seen one of these in town, and I've only ever ridden in a tractor." Jake, listening to her chatter, was already pulling a bunch of bananas out of the glove compartment. Here, take one. You don't have to peel it, just take a bite." The girl grabbed the banana greedily, but ate it slowly, as if she were stretching the pleasure. "What's your name?" Jake asked. "Lily," she said, still eating. "Okay, Lily, now tell me why you're here alone." Lily froze for a moment, then sighed softly. "Can I finish my meal first?" Jake nodded, realizing that she was just stalling, not wanting to talk about an unpleasant subject. Finally, when the banana was finished, the girl spoke reluctantly. "I live not far away, with my grandmother. I don't have a mom and dad. The neighbors call me an orphan. I don't like that word. It's sad." Jake felt something tighten inside him. "Grandma's sick. Very badly. We don't even have a shop in our village, and the doctor comes from the neighboring village once a week. He brings medicine, but it's expensive. Once I heard my grandmother ask the doctor to lend them to her." "And?" Lily lowered her eyes. "He said no. Said the debt would snowball. Grandma wouldn't take the medicine because we only had money for food." There was silence in the car for a second. "So you decided to get the money yourself," Jake said. Lily nodded. "If I look for something valuable in a junkyard, I can sell it. They pity me. They buy me easily." Jake turned to her, looking at her differently now. "What have you sold already?" Lily pulled a crumpled note out of her pocket. "I found some knitted hats, washed them in the river, and sold them. They probably thought Grandma knitted them, but she didn't," the girl admitted. Jake sighed heavily. "It's not enough for a cure," he said, more to himself than to her. "Do you remember the name of it?" Lily frowned. "It was long, written down on a piece of paper on her grandmother's dresser. Jake didn't hesitate. Let's go get it. Lily looked at him fearfully. Really? You want to help? Jake covered his eyes, holding his breath. Yes. Lily slumped. But I still have to find something else at the dump. Maybe the doctor can trade the thing for a cure. Jake shook his head. No, you don't go through the trash anymore. But the girl started inside. Okay, all right. Now help me get out of here. Okay, Jake grumbled. We've got to go over there. He put it in gear. He didn't even know what he was getting into. Jake stepped on the gas, and the SUV rolled down the bumpy road, carefully avoiding the piles of debris. Lily sat next to him, her legs dangling, looking at the interior of the car with interest. Jake didn't need to be a psychologist to realize that the girl, though she tried to look brave, still didn't trust him deep down. A strange adult man suddenly offering to help her and putting her in an expensive car. So where should I turn? He asked, watching the road carefully. Lily pointed forward with a small finger. See that big pile over there? There's a path on the left, and that's where you're supposed to go. Jake frowned. He didn't like the idea of going any further into this maze of rubbish, but he had no choice. He slowly steered the car in the direction indicated. How long have you been packing up here? He asked after a pause. It's been a month, Lily answered simply. Jake glanced at her. A month? And no one noticed? The girl shrugged. Who would notice me? Grandma's almost always asleep. We don't have many neighbors. And who'd go to the dump except people like me? Jake gripped the steering wheel tighter. It's not right. You're a kid. You shouldn't be climbing in the dirt. Lily grinned suddenly, but there was no mirth in her voice. What am I supposed to do? Grandma says there used to be a lot of people in our village, but now they've all moved away. The shop is open every other day, and the doctor comes once a week. No one helps us. Jake frowned. He was used to money having power. In his world, everything could be solved by finance. If he got sick, he called a doctor. If he needed goods, he ordered delivery. If he got lost, he switched on the navigator. But here, in the middle of nowhere, his usual rules didn't work. So we'll deal with it, he said, as if he'd made an internal decision. Lily pointed to a narrow path between the bushes. This way. The car pulled out from behind the hill, and Jake saw a strange sight. Before him was a village carved out of the past. Houses built in the last century. The roofs were sagging, the windows were covered with dirt, and the yards looked empty and abandoned. That's our house with the number 3 on it, Lily said, pointing to one of the older wooden houses. Jake parked in front of a ramshackle fence that was barely hanging on by its rusty hinges. Lily nimbly jumped out of the car, pushed open the door, and it creaked open. Grandmother, she called loudly, running inside. Jake stood on the doorstep, breathing in the musty air of the house. It smelled of damp, old wood and something else, either medicine or mothballs. Lotta's grandmother, a yellowing, gaunt woman with gray hair, was lying in the tiny room, on a rickety bed. She turned her head slowly at her granddaughter's voice. Where have you been? Her voice was weak, but there was tenderness in it. I found a good uncle to help me, Lily said cheerfully and tiptoed over to the dresser. Jake walked in, barely suppressing the urge to clench his nose. Poverty was evident in every detail of the place. The old faded carpet, the shabby linens, the cracked dishes on the wooden table. Who are you? The grandmother looked up at him with a weakened gaze. Jake remembered Lily saying there weren't many people here. The old woman probably hadn't seen a strange face in a long time. Let's just say I'm a charity worker, he said, knowing he shouldn't tell her the truth just yet. The woman laughed hoarsely. Charities don't come here, son. Lily found the recipe sheet and handed it to Jake. Here. Grandma says she can't walk without these pills. Jake turned the paper over, but the doctor's handwriting was so indistinct he couldn't make it out. They'll sort it out at the pharmacy, he mumbled, folding the paper. Grandmother looked at him tiredly. If it's not too much trouble, bring the medicine. Jake felt heavy once again. You don't have to pay anything. I'll bring them just like that. The woman frowned, but didn't say anything. Lily, on the other hand, was radiant with joy. Really? So Grandma's going to get better? Of course, Jake said, not knowing how true he was being. He glanced at the walls, at the faded photographs in cheap frames. One of them showed a young woman holding a baby girl. Is that your mom? He asked quietly, pointing to the picture. Lily nodded. She died when I was 5. I never had a daddy. Jake looked away. An abandoned child, a lonely old woman, not counting illness. It was too much, even for him. Jake, can I ask you a question? Lily asked, tilting her head. Sure. Do you have children? Jake clenched his jaw. Yes, I do. Where are they? He held his breath. My daughter's in the hospital right now. She's sick. Lily frowned. How's my grandmother? Jake looked at her. Probably. The girl folded her arms across her chest thoughtfully. But you said your grandmother would get better. Does that mean your daughter will, too? Jake felt his heart clench. I hope so, he said, not telling the girl the truth. His daughter, Kira, hadn't recovered for weeks. The doctors had their hands full, not knowing what was happening to her. For the first time in his life, Jake felt like he had no control over the situation. Money didn't help, connections didn't provide answers, and the doctors, despite the huge sums he paid them, were as helpless as the ones who treated Lily's grandmother. Jake, can I come with you? The girl asked suddenly. Where to? To the hospital. I want to see where they treat children. He didn't know why he'd agreed. Perhaps he just wanted someone in this story to remain naive and believe in miracles. All right, but then I'll bring you back. Lily nodded happily. It was a deal. Jake couldn't have guessed that this meeting would change everything. The drive into town was longer than he'd anticipated. As the SUV carefully navigated the bumpy road, Lily couldn't keep still. She fidgeted, peered out the window, yanked her seatbelt, and peppered the man with questions. Is the hospital big? Are there a lot of kids there? Are they all sick like my grandmother? Do the doctors have white coats, like in the movies? Jake grinned and pushed a little harder on the gas. The hospital is huge. They treat both children and adults. Doctors do wear white coats, but that doesn't make them any smarter, he muttered to himself. Lily frowned. Aren't they supposed to help? They should. But sometimes they just don't know what to do. The girl thought for a moment, then asked timidly, And your daughter, has she been there long? Jake clenched his jaw. A few weeks now. She's sleeping. Lily nodded, but didn't elaborate. How do you explain to a 6-year-old that your daughter is in the hospital and you can't do anything but watch? Lily sighed and stared out the window, fingers intertwined in a lock. Does she have toys? Of course, Jake answered, though deep down he knew that the expensive dolls and stuffed animals that lined Kira's room were no substitute for real warmth. What if she was sad? Lily glanced at him. Maybe if she felt someone loved her, she'd wake up. The words hit Jake harder than he'd expected. He took his eyes off the road for a second to look at the girl. A simple country girl who knew far more about life than she should at her age was saying something he was afraid to admit to himself. I tell her every day that I love her, he said quietly. Lily pressed her lips together. What if it's not enough? Jake couldn't answer. The sun was setting as they drove into town. Lily pressed her nose against the glass, looking at the streets as excitedly as if she were seeing them for the first time. Wow, it's all lit up. She exhaled in delight, pointing to the neon signs of the shops. Why do you have so many cars in this town? Jake grinned tiredly. Because people are in a hurry. Where? Who's going to work? Who's going home? Who's going to the hospital? Lily asked. Jake gripped the steering wheel. Yes. Lily nodded, clearly satisfied with her conclusion, and stared out the window again. When they finally reached the hospital, the girl suddenly froze. This is the building. Is this where your daughter is being treated? Yes. She seemed enchanted. It looked like a castle. Jake grinned. Believe me, Lily, if it were a castle, my daughter would have been cured long ago. They got out of the car. Jake helped the girl down, then they headed for the entrance. And keep quiet, he warned. Lily nodded, but the curiosity in her eyes was too obvious. A guard met them in the lobby, glancing at a well-groomed man in an expensive suit and a girl who was clearly not from here. Hello, Jake. I know you need to see your daughter. The guard nodded, but looked at Lily with slight doubt. This is my niece, Jake said calmly. The man frowned, but didn't say anything. He knew it was useless to argue with Jake. When they reached the first floor and entered the room, Lily was abruptly silent. In the center of the room, Kira lay on a wide hospital bed. Pale and frail, with an 4 in her hand, she looked like a porcelain doll. "She's really asleep," Lily whispered, afraid to disturb the silence. Jake walked over to the bed and gently adjusted the blanket. "Yeah, it's been too long." Lily took a step forward, but suddenly her gaze fell on the empty medicine bottle on the nightstand. She picked it up, twirled it around, then frowned. "Is something wrong?" Jake asked, surprised by her reaction. Lily pressed her lips together. "I can read what it says." Jake turned sharply towards her. "Can you read Swedish?" Lily nodded. "Yes, Grandma says I'm a fast learner. We had an old book at home with translations of words. A dictionary, I think it was called." Jake frowned. "What did it say?" Lily read it, wrinkling her forehead. Then she said slowly, "It says that each drop contains 200 milliliters of the active ingredient." Jake shuddered. 200 milliliters? He grabbed the bottle, pulled out his phone, and switched on the translator. "No, that can't be right," he whispered, reading the text on the screen. But there was no mistake. The medicine Kira had been given was not what the doctor had prescribed. What's more, it was 3 times the dosage. Jake's chest grew cold. "That's not the medicine Kira was prescribed," he said. Lily stared at him wide-eyed. "Does that mean she's being treated wrong?" Jake rose to his feet. His thoughts raced frantically. If Kira is being poisoned on purpose, then it must be someone else's intent. Doctors, nurses, or someone else. He couldn't stay here. He had to test the medication. "Lily, we're leaving." "Where to?" "To the lab." He grabbed the bottle, took the girl's hand, and hurried to the exit. Somewhere deep in his chest, a rage was awakening. Someone wanted his daughter not to wake up at all. Jake drove faster than he should have. Lily sat beside him, clutching her seatbelt tightly, and occasionally glanced at him anxiously. She could feel the tension building inside him. The air in the cabin seemed to thicken with what was going on in his head. "Jake, are you mad?" "Yes, Lily, I'm very angry," he answered, not even trying to hide his anger. She fidgeted a little, not knowing what to say. Her eyes darted between the bottle of medicine Jake held in his hand and his face, grim as a thunderstorm. "What if it's just a mistake?" she asked quietly. Jake clenched his teeth. If it's a mistake, someone has to answer for it. And if it isn't? He didn't finish, but Lily guessed that didn't bode well. Jake's mind was racing with thoughts, one more disturbing than the other. If Kira was really being given the wrong medicine, and in such frantic doses, then maybe she wasn't being cured, but poisoned. But why? And who could be involved? They reached the lab 20 minutes later. Jake, wasting no time, parked right outside the entrance. Lily hurried after him, barely keeping up with his steps. "A friend of mine works here," he said, pushing open the door. A girl in a white coat was sitting at the front desk, but she perked up when she saw Jake. "Jake? What are you doing here?" "I need Leonard. It's urgent." She nodded and dialed a number on the phone. A minute later, a man in his 40s, with neatly styled dark hair, came out of the corridor. He looked at Jake and Lily in surprise, then grinned. "You look like you're ready to kill someone. What's wrong?" "Look at this." Jake handed him a bottle. "It's urgent. I need to know exactly what was in it, and if it's what the label says it is." Leonard raised his eyebrows, but seeing that his friend wasn't in the mood for jokes, he nodded silently. "Good. Leave it with me. But these analyses aren't quick. I can do it by tonight, but not before." Jake clenched his fists. "It's very important." Leonard just threw up his hands. "I get it, but there's no such thing as magic. Call me tonight." Jake nodded, turned and headed for the exit. Lily hurried after him again, tangling herself in the long sleeves of her grandmother's jacket. "So, what now?" she asked as soon as they were outside. Jake wondered. There was no point in going back to the hospital, but back to the village. "Now we'll take care of your grandmother," he said. "We have to get her medicine." Lily nodded happily. "Really?" "Really," Jake said, heading for the car. On the way to the pharmacy, Jake thought about what awaited him tonight. If Leonard confirmed his worst fears, it would mean that someone had switched Kira's medicine on purpose, and then he'd have a new goal of finding out exactly who was behind it. But for now, he pushed those thoughts aside. Right now, he had a small village waiting for him and a sick woman who needed help. When they pulled into the pharmacy, Lily couldn't stop turning her head, looking at the shelves of medicines. So many things. She whispered excitedly. Jake slipped the pharmacist a prescription, and the pharmacist began to collect the medication. Do you have someone to supervise their administration? She asked, looking at the girl. I'll explain everything to Grandma, Jake answered. The woman nodded, then punched the check and said the amount. Jake didn't even pay attention, just paid with his card. Lily's eyes widened when she saw the number of zeros on the check. So much money, she whispered. Jake grinned. Health is more expensive. When they got back to the car, the girl clutched the bag of medicine tightly to her chest, as if it were the most valuable treasure of all. Thank you, Jake. He nodded, starting the engine. He suddenly felt better. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he could help someone. It was dark by the time they reached the village. The lanterns didn't work, of course, but Lily pointed the way to the house without error. Grandmother, she shouted, running inside. The old woman raised herself up on the bed, looking at her granddaughter in surprise. Lily, what's wrong? Jake came in next, putting the medicine on the table. Your pills, Margaret. You have no right to be sick now. The woman stared at the packets, then looked back at him. I don't know how to thank you. You don't have to. Just take your medicine on time. The old woman smiled weakly. Okay, son. Lily glowed. You're going to be all right now. Jake looked at this picture and felt calm for the first time in a long time. But deep down, he knew the storm was just beginning. He sat at the table, watching Margaret carefully going through the medication packets. Her knotted fingers trembled, not from weakness, but from surprise. She didn't seem to believe to the last that anyone would really help, that this stranger in an expensive suit had brought her salvation for nothing. Lily settled down beside her, propping her head up with her hands. She looked at her grandmother with joyful anticipation, as if she hoped that once she took one pill, she would get up and go for a walk with her. It is necessary to take strictly according to the instructions, finally said the old woman, thoughtfully looking at the blister with pills. Because you know, Lily, medicine is like that. If you use it right, it can cure you, but if you don't, it can make it worse. Jake felt an unpleasant tingle inside. He knew how dangerous medicine could be if it wasn't used properly. Margaret finally looked up at him. Jake, son, how am I going to pay you back for all this? He waved her off. I wouldn't charge you a cent even if I wanted to. It doesn't work that way, the old woman sighed. Nobody gives you anything for nothing. I'm not a nobody, he said calmly, and I don't expect anything in return. The woman looked at him gratefully, but there was doubt in her eyes. Jake had seen it more than once. People who'd spent their lives fighting for every cent they had couldn't believe that help could come for nothing. Okay, if you don't want money, at least have some tea on the way out, she said at last, and rose slowly from the bed. Kira jumped up immediately, supporting her under her elbow, and Jake couldn't help but smile. The girl was small, but already so caring, so grown up. Let me light the cooker myself, he suggested. The old woman raised her eyebrows in surprise. You know how to make a cooker, too? Jake shrugged. I had to when I was a kid. My father thought a boy should know how to do everything. Emma nodded. That's right. A boy who grew up in a greenhouse isn't going to be a good man. He grinned. Father had thought the same thing. While the water was boiling, Lily paced the kitchen, fetching cups and saucers. Jake noticed that she just couldn't sit still. She wanted to be useful, wanted this day to be remembered not just for Grandma getting her medicine, but for something warm and homey. Oh, Jake, have you ever had tea with raspberry jam? She asked, leaning toward him. He was a little surprised. Of course. And grandmother's jam? No, not with Grandma's. Then you should try it. Jake laughed, but Lily was already rummaging through the cupboard, pulling out an old glass jar with a slightly blackened lid and handing it to him. Here, this is the most delicious. My grandmother made it last year, when she could still pick berries. Margaret hummed. I could still do it now, if it weren't for this weakness. You'll get better, and you'll be back to picking raspberries, Lily said firmly. Jake nodded. Lily was right. The important thing is to stay on top of it. The old woman grinned and set the cup in front of him. Well, try it, if your granddaughter insists. He scooped up a spoonful of thick jam and stirred it into the tea. The vapor rose above the cup, filling the air with a warm and sweet aroma. Jake took a sip and nodded. Good. Lily brightened. Really? Really? It was the only way to heal. They sat at the table, drinking tea, and for the first time in a long time, Jake felt his tension ease a little. There was something real in this old house, among the creaky floorboards and faded wallpaper, something he'd lost long ago. But soon he remembered the call he'd been waiting for. Jake pulled out his phone and looked at the screen. There wasn't much time left until tonight. I have to go soon, he said, getting up. Lily frowned. You're coming back, aren't you? He looked at her. Of course. She nodded, but there was still doubt in her eyes. Promise? He sat up again and held out his hand, looking her earnestly in the eye. Lily, I always keep my promises. The girl hesitated, then put her palm on his hand. Good then. Jake looked at Margaret again, made sure she'd taken the first pill, and then headed for the exit. Thank you, son, the old woman said quietly as she looked at him. He didn't answer, just nodded. As he got into the car, Jake felt a deep anxiety rising in his chest. Now he was going to find out the truth. Jake sat behind the wheel, staring gloomily at the road. Tension grew inside him. He sensed that the answers he feared were close at hand. The call was due any moment. The city greeted him with cold streetlights, streams of cars, and crowds of people going about their business, unaware of the storm that was playing out in one man's head. Jake turned towards the lab, but no sooner had he parked than the phone in his pocket vibrated. He answered it immediately. Well? His voice sounded sharper than he'd intended. A sigh was heard on the other end of the line. Leonard's voice was serious. It's bad, Jake. The drug they gave you is not what your daughter was supposed to be given. It's completely different from the original drug, Leonard continued. And the worst part, Jake, is the dosage is monstrous. 200 milligrams is 3 times what you can give a child. Jake closed his eyes. Everything he'd suspected was confirmed. So she'd been poisoned. His voice was muffled. Leonard hesitated. I don't want to jump to conclusions, but yes, it looks that way. Jake felt anger fill him. He wanted to go to the hospital immediately and demand an explanation. But he knew that if he snapped now, if he went through with it, he could only hurt himself. Who had access to the drugs? He asked, trying to control himself. The head doctor, the nurse, and of course the hospital pharmacy. But that doesn't mean they're all involved, Leonard replied. If you want to get to the bottom of this, you have to be careful. Jake realized that now he would have to play by different rules. Thank you, Leonard. Keep me posted, he said, and he hung up. Jake leaned back in his seat. He knew now that his daughter had been deliberately poisoned, and he intended to find out who was behind it. Before heading back to the hospital, he decided to stop by the house. He needed to catch his breath, gather his thoughts, and decide what to do next. The flat greeted him with silence. Without Kira, the house seemed empty, cold, as if no one had lived there for a long time. Jake went into the children's room and sat on the edge of his daughter's bed. Everything was the same as the day she'd been taken to the hospital. The shelf with her favorite books, the toys neatly stacked, the nightlight she'd always asked him to leave on. Jake took the stuffed bunny from the shelf. It was a little shabby, with the bow barely held in place. Kira hadn't parted with it since she was 3. He ran his finger over the soft fabric and sighed heavily. We'll get through this, baby. I promise you. His phone vibrated again. Jake glanced at the screen an unknown number. He frowned, but answered. Jake? The voice on the other end was muffled, as if the speaker had distorted it on purpose. You'd better not stick your nose where it doesn't belong. Jake felt his insides tighten. Who was that? Never mind. Just a friendly word of advice. Don't stick your rich nose where it doesn't belong. Jake clenched the phone in his hand, so tight his knuckles turned white. If anything happens to my daughter, I'll bury you. There was a short laugh. It had already happened. The connection went dead. Jake froze, feeling the cold creeping in. He couldn't delay any longer. 20 minutes later, he was already entering the hospital. The guard again stopped him at the entrance, but this time Jake wasn't going to delay. Let me through. His voice was low, threatening. It's late, the guard tried to object, but Jake gave him a look that made him nod and back away. He walked briskly to the head doctor's office. The door was ajar, and someone was talking inside. Jake pushed it open and walked in, not bothering to knock. We need to talk, he said. The head doctor, a man in his 50s with a tired face, looked up from his papers. Jake, I told you, visiting hours are over. Jake stepped closer and abruptly placed a bottle of medicine on the table. What's this? The doctor hesitated. Your daughter's medication, I understand. No, it's not what you prescribed for her. I checked the ingredients. It's not the same drug, and the dosage is 3 times higher. There was silence in the room. The doctor's eyes widened. That's impossible, he objected. It's possible, Jake interrupted coldly, and I want to know how it got to my daughter. The doctor turned pale. Jake, I swear, I had nothing to do with it. Jake squinted his eyes. Then who did? The doctor rose slowly. There's been some kind of mistake. Someone mixed up the packages. Jake slammed his fist on the table, making the doctor wince. Don't blame it on a mistake. I want the culprit. The doctor ran his hand across his forehead, clearly thinking feverishly. Nurses have access to the medication. It's a streamlined system. I've been told that. But does anyone in particular do it? The head doctor exhaled heavily. Sophia. Who's Sophia? The head nurse. She's in charge of dispensing medication. Jake felt anger flaring inside him. Where is she? The doctor hesitated. Yeah. I can't just. Jake leaned closer. Either you take me to her now, or I'm going to make such a scandal you'll be in trouble. The doctor realized there was no point in arguing. All right, let's go. Jake knew the truth was close at hand, and he wasn't going to stop. Jake had already acted. As soon as he heard confirmation that his daughter was indeed being bullied, he immediately called a detective he knew, Michael. Michael was not just a lawyer, but a man who knew how to get the truth out and break down even the most impregnable walls. Michael, Jake's voice was firm, unemotional. It's urgent. I need you to dig into the hospital, especially all the records of what medications were prescribed to Kira. Who signed them? Who's in charge of storage? Who gives the orders? Michael didn't ask any questions. I'll do it. How much time do I have? The sooner the better. Then we'll have the first report by morning. Jake didn't doubt his word. Michael was the kind of man who never promised what he couldn't deliver. Now the only thing left to deal with was Sophia. The head doctor, walking beside Jake down the empty hospital corridor, was clearly nervous. He kept adjusting the collar of his coat, coughing, and trying not to make eye contact with Jake, who walked beside him with a quick, firm stride. Sophia's been here for 10 years, he finally said, trying to sound calm. Good nurse. Responsible. Jake grinned. Yeah, so responsible that she almost killed my daughter. The head doctor turned pale. Yeah, I don't know, Jake. I don't want to jump to conclusions until I talk to her myself. Jake didn't answer anything. He was already angry enough not to listen to excuses. Finally, they stopped at a door that had a sign on it that said, Chief Nurse's Office. Ready? The doctor asked, clearly hoping Jake would change his mind. Open it. The head doctor knocked nervously, then turned the knob. Sophia was sitting at the desk, sorting through some papers. She was a woman of about 35, with dark hair pulled back in a bun and eyes that ran too fast with worry as soon as she saw the people who had entered. Oh, doctor. Her voice was even, but there was tension in it. Is something wrong? The head doctor coughed, but Jake didn't let him speak. Sophia, he stepped closer, his gaze fixed on her face. You were giving my daughter medication. She blinked. Of course, I keep track of all the medications. Jake set the bottle of medication on the table. You gave this to her too, Jake said, setting the bottle on the table. Sophia glanced briefly at the bottle, but Jake didn't miss the subtle flash of panic in her eyes. It's a drug that, she hesitated for a second, searching for words, was prescribed to your daughter. That's not true, Jake interrupted her sharply. It's the wrong drug. Sophia frowned. I'm sorry, but I don't know what you're talking about. It's the wrong compound, the wrong dosage, and it's not what the doctor ordered. The woman tried to remain calm, but her fingers began to tremble visibly. Maybe there's been a mistake, she began. But Jake thumped his fist on the table, making her wince. Mistakes don't happen when you give a kid a drug that's slowly killing him, he said. The head doctor faltered nervously. Sophia, if it's true, you'd better tell me everything now. Yeah, I'm just dispensing the drugs, she said. I don't know what's in them. I get them from the pharmacy, give them to the nurses, and they put in the IVs. Jake squinted. Who brings the drugs in? She shifted her gaze to the head doctor, clearly hoping he would help her out. The drugs are supplied centrally. Through the pharmaceutical company, he began. But Jake interrupted him. Specifically, who brought it? Sophia looked away. The last few shipments had come through a new supplier. Jake clenched his fists. The name? I don't know, she breathed out. You're lying, he said coldly. She swallowed nervously, then finally squirmed. John. Jake felt like he'd been hit over the head. John. His father. There was a dead silence in the office. Jake looked at Sophia, and for the first time in his life, he didn't know what to say. Are you sure? He asked, trying to keep his voice calm, but even he could hear the anger in it. Sophia swallowed. He found me through my husband. Said he wanted to help with the medicine. Said he could get it cheaper. Jake exhaled slowly, trying to comprehend what he was saying. Did you realize you were giving my daughter the wrong thing? Sophia looked away. Yeah. I didn't know for sure. Jake didn't let her finish. You wanted the money. She flinched. I have 3 kids. My husband's in debt. He said if I helped, he'd pay off some of the loan. Jake turned away, trying to calm down. You don't even know what you've done? Sophia clutched at the table, her shoulders shaking. I didn't think it was. I just wanted the family to. Jake wasn't listening anymore. He turned and walked towards the exit. The head doctor stared at him in silence, hesitant to say a word. As Jake reached for the doorknob, Sophia suddenly sobbed. I'm sorry. Jake froze for a second. Ask Kira for forgiveness, he said, and walked out. All he felt was rage. Now he knew who wanted to kill his daughter. His own father. This week had turned into a real storm. Jake couldn't remember the last time he'd slept properly. His mind was racing day and night. Everything he'd once thought was solid and unshakable had turned out to be a fragile illusion. Michael worked nonstop. By the time Jake learned of his father's involvement, the lawyer had already dug deep enough for them to have their first serious leads. John's been involved in some shady drug supply schemes. Michael informed them as they sat in his office, which was piled high with paperwork. It wasn't just an accident. He'd gone into pharmaceuticals on purpose, and unofficially at that. Jake sat across from him, his fingers firmly interlocked. He was financing a front company that was contracting to supply medicines to private and public hospitals, Michael continued, looking at the printouts of bank transfers. It wasn't his company, of course, but everything was done through his proxies. So he used front companies to distribute the fake drugs. Jake said slowly, enunciating each word carefully. Michael nodded. Exactly. But your daughter is a special case here. According to my records, Kira is the only patient who has been prescribed this drug. No other hospital in the city has used it. Jake sighed. So he did it on purpose. Michael exhaled heavily and set the papers aside. So far we have no proof that he purposely poisoned Kira, but that he knew he was supplying substandard medicine is a fact. Jake clenched his fists. I don't need proof. I know what he's capable of, he said quietly. Personal speculation won't hold up in court, mate. We need hard evidence. Jake was silent. His head was buzzing. His father had always been tough, cold, but he couldn't believe he'd stooped to attempting to kill his own child. We've got to get him out, he said finally. Michael crossed his arms over his chest. Do you have a plan? Jake looked at him. Let's get him to confess. They worked on the plan for 2 days. Jake didn't just want to expose his father. He wanted to make sure he couldn't get away with it. To do this, they decided to use an old tried and tested method, a fake conversation. Michael had organized a hidden recording and Jake was going to talk to his father personally to get a confession out of him. Does he suspect that you found out something? Michael asked as they sat in the car, discussing the details. Jake shook his head. I don't think so, not yet. But he can already sense that I'm digging. Michael nodded. Then don't act too harshly. Yeah, and give him a chance to feel safe enough to talk. Jake gripped the steering wheel. I'll do whatever it takes. Michael looked at him carefully. Jake, are you ready for this? Jake didn't answer right away. Honestly, I don't. Not long ago, I wouldn't have believed my father capable of such a thing. But now I know the truth. Don't lose it, Michael warned him. We need his confession. Jake nodded. Don't worry. I'll make it clean. Michael sighed. Good. Then let's get going. They glanced round. Their trap was ready. The next day, Jake called his father. We need to meet, he said, trying to keep his voice steady. What's this about, son? John's voice was as calm as ever. Business. There's a project I want to discuss. Silence. All right. Where do you want to meet? Your office. Tonight. Okay. I'll wait for you. Jake slowly hung up the phone. Now all he had to do was play his part. He knew this meeting would change everything. Jake drove to meet his father, gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. Fury raged inside him, but he knew he had to stay cool if he wanted to see this through. This conversation wouldn't just be unpleasant. It would be the end of their relationship. John's office was downtown, in one of those austere gray buildings where power, money, and cold calculation permeate everything. The guard, recognizing him, nodded silently, letting him inside. When Jake entered the office, his father was sitting at the massive oak desk, carelessly thumbing through papers. Hello, son, he said, not even lifting his head. Jake sat silently across from him. It's been a long time, John continued, finally putting the papers aside and scrutinizing his son. You look nervous. Jake smiled at the corner of his lips. Yes, I've been on edge lately. His father tilted his head slightly, as if studying him. You didn't want to talk about business, did you? Jake paused. Right. His father nodded, as if he understood. So you found out. Jake felt his insides tighten. What was I supposed to find out? John leaned back in his chair, interlocking his fingers. Leave it alone. I'm not stupid. If you're here, you've already figured it out. Jake looked straight into his icy eyes. Then tell me yourself. John grinned. I knew you were a smart boy. Just like me. Jake gritted his teeth. So you're not even going to deny that you poisoned my daughter? There was dead silence in the office. His father raised his eyebrows slightly. That's harsh, Jake. What makes you think it was poisoning? Jake leaned forward slowly. Because I checked the cure. I know it wasn't what the doctors prescribed. I know the dosage was lethal. And I know you were behind those deliveries. John smiled. Let's say. Jake felt the anger boiling up inside him. Is that all you're going to say? His father swayed slightly in his chair, as if this conversation was light entertainment. You think I wanted her dead? Jake stared at him, unblinking. What else could it have been? John leaned closer. I wanted to spare you from making a mistake. Jake didn't immediately realize what he'd said. A mistake? You don't understand? John sighed, shaking his head. That kid ruined your life. Jake felt his insides tighten into an icy lump. You're talking about my daughter. John leaned back. I'm talking about the time you put around your neck. Time? Jake tilted his head slightly, as if he couldn't believe his ears. His father looked at him with cold superiority. You could have been anything you wanted to be. I gave you everything you needed to get to the top. But you dash, he grimaced, as if the word itself disgusted him. Fell in love. Jake hooked his fingers into the armrest. And that woman ruined you. She dragged you down, and when she died, you had a chance to start over. But instead of taking it, you attached yourself to her daughter. Jake exhaled slowly, trying not to snap. That girl, my daughter, it's a mistake. The father's voice was even, almost calm. You could have been free, but you let yourself be weak again. Jake couldn't believe what was happening. You wanted to kill her, he whispered, not taking his eyes off his father's face. I wanted to save you, John corrected him. You poisoned my daughter. Jake slammed his fist down on the table, making the papers fly apart. His father only grinned. She was supposed to die slowly and quietly. The doctors would have thrown up their hands, said the body couldn't cope. You would have grieved. But in the end, you'd realize it was for the best. Jake stared at him, disbelieving his hearing. You sick bastard. John sighed, as if he was bored with this conversation. Son, I did it for you. Jake stood up abruptly. You did it for you. Because you couldn't stand that I wasn't a copy of you. Dad shrugged. Maybe. Jake clenched his fists, barely containing himself. You know what the funny thing is, father? John raised his eyebrows. Jake pulled the phone out of his pocket and placed it on the table. The screen was glowing. The recorder was on. Dad's face twisted. You. I recorded everything, Jake said coldly. Every word you said. His father jumped up and grabbed the phone, but Jake didn't even flinch. Too late, he grinned. My lawyer already has the tape. John froze. You set me up? Jake leaned toward him, his eyes burning with icy fire. No, father. You destroyed yourself. At that moment, the door opened, and two men in civilian clothes entered the office. John Jefferson, you're under arrest. Jake stepped back, allowing them to approach. John stared as if he couldn't believe what was happening. You wouldn't dare, Jake grinned tiredly. You taught me that. One of the operatives cuffed him. You've committed attempted murder of a minor. His father looked at Jake with rage and contempt. You're not my son. Jake snorted. And you're not my father. He turned away and headed for the exit without looking back. Checkmate. His daughter was safe now. John Jefferson's trial ended the way it was supposed to, with a verdict and handcuffs. When Jake walked into the courtroom that day, he saw his father sitting in the dock, not broken, not remorseful, but full of contempt and anger. You destroyed your family, he said through gritted teeth as Jake walked past. Jake froze for a second, but then grinned. I never had a family. The trial didn't last long. The evidence, the records, the doctor's testimony, and Sophia's own plea bargain had done their job. The judge pronounced the sentence clearly and without emotion. 20 years of strict regime. The father did not utter a word. He didn't even look at Jake as he was led away under escort. And Jake didn't look back, either. The past no longer existed. Kira woke up 2 weeks after she'd been taken out of the hospital. Jake was sitting by her bedside, holding her small hand in his, when suddenly he felt a faint but obvious squeeze in return. Daddy? Jake looked up sharply, and in the next instant his heart seemed to explode with happiness. She was looking at him with clear, though tired eyes. Baby, can you hear me? His voice trembled and a lump rose to his throat. Kira nodded slowly. I'm so tired of sleeping. Jake couldn't hold back the tears. He leaned down and hugged her tightly, feeling all the fear, all the anger, all the pain recede. It's over, sweetheart, he whispered. Everything will be all right now. When Kira was finally on the mend, Jake knew it was time to fulfill another promise. He went back to the village. Lily ran out to meet him as soon as she heard the sound of his car. Jake, she screamed, rushing to him. He took her in his arms, and she started talking, interrupting herself. Grandma's better. I read books to her, and she told me stories, and I learned to bake cakes. Do you want to try? Jake laughed. Of course I do. Margaret walked out onto the porch, now without the stick, without the weakness in her eyes. She was still the same old woman, but now there was more life in her gaze. I didn't expect to see you again, she said, smiling. I always keep my word, Jake replied. Lily looked up at him with shining eyes. And how is your daughter? Jake smiled. She's much better. And she wants to meet the girl who saved her life. Lily shuddered in surprise. Really? Really? Jake confirmed. Lily bit her lip, but then nodded happily. I really want to be friends with her. Jake grinned and ruffled her hair. Then you have your whole life ahead of you to make it happen. Soon things really did get better. Margaret no longer suffered without her medication. Jake had bought her a small, cozy house close to town so that Lily wouldn't have to live in the cold and loneliness. Kira had become fast friends with Lily. Now they rode bikes together, went to the park, and played together as if they'd known each other all their lives. Jake didn't feel empty inside for the first time in a long time. Now he could come home and hear his daughter laughing. No longer did he sit in gloomy silence, afraid that tomorrow might be worse than today. Now he had the present, not just the memory of what he had lost. One day, as he watched Kira and Lily drawing with crayons on the pavement, Margaret came out onto his veranda and sat beside him. Well, son, are you happy now? Jake looked at the girls and nodded. Yes, he answered. I'm happy now. Life wasn't perfect, but now there was room for something real, and it was worth everything he'd been through. Subscribe to the channel, like and share your thoughts on this story. Click on the bell not to miss new videos. See you soon, dear listeners.